So let's talk about repeating stories in a job interview. And if you want a concise version of this video, is that people do not usually get rejected specifically for this reason of repeating stories, but this issue of repeating story is something very common in job interviews. And the primary reason why I make this video is to clarify a little bit what repeating these stories actually means, and how can you actually use it to your advantage, or how can other candidates use it to their advantage, or already used it to their advantage quite successfully. So let's first define what do I mean by repeating stories in a job interview. The first scenario is that you repeat the same story within the same interview, in other words, with the same interview round, and more often than not, you'd prefer to talk about a sub-project of the project that you earlier talked about. And I believe this is also a kind of dangerous approach. And the second scenario where you repeat stories in a job interview is when you repeat the same story with different interviewers. So these would be the two main scenarios to keep in mind here. Now, how do these interviewers spot this repetition? Well, for the first scenario with the same interviewer, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you're talking to the same person, but if they are different people, you should understand that they will take plenty of notes during these behavioral interviews, and the best companies will always have people who really talk between each other, and they will have a debrief session where they decide basically, hey, what's going on this candidate, what they like, what they didn't like, and the stories that you talked about, aside from the notes they took. So that's how they spot this potential problem. Now, who is the most likely to have this problem? And here it gets a little bit more interesting. In my experience, the people that are most likely to fall into this trap is the ones that underestimate the intensity of a behavioral interview. And yes, this happens quite a lot. Of course, it happens more for people that didn't prepare, but I would say that my advice to you here would be to rather be paranoid about preparing for these job interviews than taking them lightly. Another scenario where people fall into this problem is where people prepare quantitatively for these stories. In other words, you prepare for the number. You have to have 20 stories, and once you have those 20 stories, you're done. What happens is that you will have, let's say, 7 A-game stories, and the rest will be, the rest. And during the interview, because you will notice that the bar will be so high, when you will get a question for which you cannot use your A story, you will immediately panic, because you'll know that your filler stories will not work. So you will have the tendency to reuse that quality stories that you prepared for the interview. And finally, the last scenario, and an interesting one of people who fall into this problem, is the people who actually want to intentionally use only their best stories, their, let's say, 5 stories, to spin them around, because they know that during a behavioral interview you're scored on the quality of the stories that you communicate. Right? So if you always give the best possible story, you're always going to score the highest points. So unless they spot you that you are repeating your stories and you're annoying, you will get actually scored the maximum possible points, right? So this is actually a hack in behavioral interviews, and it happens more often than you might think. In fact, this is something that it's actually recommended to do for phone screening rounds, to always use only the best stories, never use filler stories in phone interviews. Better spin your best possible stories than to use your filler stories in a phone interview, because that's basically a gamble to the extent that you convince them you're a risk worth taking for the on-site interview. So these would be the 3 scenarios of people that are the most likely to fall into this problem. Now, how often does this occur? And I touched upon this briefly in the introduction of this video. In my experience, I think I only remember one time when someone specifically told me that I received the rejection feedback that I repeated my stories too much, and that's why they rejected me, only once. However, the problem of candidates repeating or being afraid or actually repeating the stories in the interview themselves is very, very common. It's a widespread problem. I wouldn't say necessarily a disqualifier by any means. I know plenty of people who repeated their stories and who actually got into great roles, senior roles, not just junior roles, if you think about it. Now, what's the fix here? How do you fix this repetitiveness, or how do you manage the risk, if you want? Because there's also, this angle that you want to take into consideration. So the first fix, if you have to repeat a story during multiple rounds of interviews, chances are you're going to be more likely to repeat that story towards the end of your overall within the last rounds. And if you're likely to do this in the last rounds, one approach that I know works is to ask your interviewer prior to using your story, hey, interviewer, I have this extraordinary great example, but unfortunately I used it with your colleague just in my previous session. So could you ask me another question, or do you think it would be fine if I use the same story? And from experience, they will prefer to ask you another question because they have plenty of these questions that they might ask you. And again, I know this is a well-tested method. I know it works, and I very much encourage you to use this as well. The second fix for this, and I know it's a bit generic, but you must prepare these stories thoroughly. And again, I touched upon the quantitative approach. If you target for 20 stories and you don't really raise the bar on the quality on those 20 stories, chances are you run out of A-game stories quite quickly. So from experience, most people have to go through these stories at least 5 times. So if you haven't, please try to go through 5 times. And of course, repeat role play, self-assess to see where you're actually in the process. The other fix you'd want to apply here is to ensure that you cover a broad range of behaviors for a job interview. And here, I always advertise Amazon's 14 leadership principles. Even you can take 2 questions for each of these principles and basically ensure that you have stories for these specific behaviors. This is the great example that's, by the way, not just for Amazon interviews, but with any high-performing company. And I found it works great for many other, for pretty much any role that has a serious behavioral interview, right? So ensure that you have a broad range of behaviors. And last but not least, the fix, if during the interview simply you don't have another story, or you simply want to take a little bit more risk because you feel like that one story is what will make the difference in your case, keep in mind that a story is usually identified in the situation part of your star answer if you want. So in the situation you might say, hey, I had a project 2 years ago, it was project X for company Y. I was leading a team of 5 engineers, right? And this is the personally identifiable information, if that makes any sense. So if you change that information slightly, if you just say, hey, 2 years ago while leading a team of 5 engineers, or there were 3 junior engineers and 2 senior engineers, we had a project to do whatever we had to do, and I didn't name the project, I didn't name the company. I only said when it was, and a little bit more about my team. I didn't even use the same number, right? So you can anonymize, or you can change the project to make it sound slightly different, right? And if you think about it, if you're interviewing with different people, you are actually quite likely not to be spotted as talking about the same specific project. So in my opinion, that's actually a risk that it is worthwhile taking for people that really feel, like, yes, this is something essential for me to do if I want to get this job. So during the heat of the moment, yes, definitely, you should consider this risk. So all in all, I feel, there is a lot of buzz around repeating stories in job interviews. I believe, most of the time, and my experience is that most of the time people don't prepare enough stories that of high quality in the first place. But, who am I to tell you how much time you want to invest, or you have to invest for such an interview? But again, solutions exist. And if you want to take a little bit more risk, hopefully, I give you a little more information as to how do you want to go about increasing your chances to get a job offer through these behavioral interviews. So thank you very much for watching.